Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's 1 o'clock and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I'm Kristie Skoglund. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Florida Center for Early Childhood, and I appreciate you all attending the webinar today on secondary trauma. My background is in infant and early childhood mental health, and trauma-informed care is a big part of that. And secondary trauma is something that a lot of folks are talking about and a lot of folks are experiencing as a result of COVID-19. So I'm really happy to be able to do this webinar today with all of you. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. Okay. Okay. So during the webinar today, we're going to cover a lot. This is going to only be 1 hour, just in case you were wondering. I wanted to just put something out there that was short and concise, but also gave you a lot of good information about what secondary trauma is and who's most impacted and how we can, what measures we can take to protect ourselves and do some self-care. Not only in our personal lives, but also at our organizations. Especially if you are a director or an executive within an organization, it's going to be really important to think about some of the ways that we can protect staff. So today we're going to define stress, because secondary trauma is stressful. It starts with stress within our body and within the things that we're exposed to. We're going to define secondary trauma. We're going to discuss how working with traumatized population affects first responders and those in other helping professions. We're going to discuss the impact of secondary trauma on organizations, and then we're going to identify self-help kind of particular strategies that we can use in both our professional and personal life to build resilience, because we can't talk about how the negative impacts of secondary trauma without talking about how to overcome it and build resilience. So I want to start with this quote, which I absolutely love because it makes so much sense for those of you that are in the helping profession. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And that seems so obvious, but I think many times those that aren't in the helping profession don't really think about the impact that it has on those of us that are. And for those of us that are in the helping profession, we sometimes don't realize the impact that it's having on us. We just go through the motions and it just becomes a part of the way that the career that we've chosen. And we forget that these things are having major implications on our well-being, the way we see the world, the way we treat others. So I think it's important for us to remember that we absolutely are impacted by the things that we see and the things that we hear from the population that we serve. Whoops, let me go back. So first, we're going to start very basic. What is stress? It all starts with stress, right? Stress of the job. And with COVID-19, we have so many professions out there that are stressed head on. They're seeing a lot of trauma in especially the first responders, folks that are working in hospitals and dealing with patients, folks that are working with clients who are in recovery. Maybe they're involved in the child welfare or dependency system. Maybe they're part of a mental health program at your organization. But these families come with a lot and a lot of stress, and we are expected to be able to hold all of that and help these people when they come to us. So stress is the Webster Dictionary definition of stress. There are two, actually. The first is the pressure exerted upon an object that can have either strengthen it or weaken it, right? So we know stress can definitely weaken something, but it can also strengthen. You know, we need stress to be able to get through our day, to be able to protect ourselves. It's a part of how we know what danger is. So we need stress in our lives. The other definition is a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or very demanding circumstances. And I think the second definition is probably more appropriate for what we are experiencing today. I know at the Florida Center, we talk a lot in our leadership group and also with the program staff about what we're experiencing as leaders trying to help our staff, and then how our staff are helping families in the community that are experiencing a lot of adverse circumstances right now, if not because they have experienced medical issues related to COVID-19. They certainly are experiencing a lot of stress from having children at home, or financial issues from loss of a job, and it's creating a lot of tension in households. It's important to note that stress doesn't have to be real to others as long as it's real to the person experiencing it. So stress can be real or perceived. And remember, perception is reality. So if the person is feeling the stress of a particular situation, then it is absolutely stressful, regardless of what others around that person may be believing about the event, regardless of the reality. The threat, the body's response is the same. So it's important to recognize that when we hear others that might want to dismiss stress, we need to remember that the body doesn't know if it's real or imagined. It's going to respond the same way. So we've probably all heard of the fight, flight, freeze response, and that's the body's kind of natural way of responding to stress. And it's something that happens in the brain when we perceive danger. It's something that it's innate, it's primal, it's something we're born with, so that, I mean, even going back to the caveman days, this is how they knew if this was something we needed to face, or something we needed to run away from, or something we needed to fight. Our thoughts can absolutely impact the stress and the effect of the stress on our body. It's really important that we keep our thoughts in check, and that we really assess the way that we're thinking about the stress that we're experiencing in our jobs. That's where it's important, and we'll talk a little bit later about how important it is for our organizations to create a safe place for us to be able to process what's happening to us on a day-to-day basis, because the things that we see and hear are really hard. It's unfortunate. These are unfortunate things that happen to other people, and we are hearing them and being expected to respond. And so I think it's important that we have a way to protect ourselves and keep ourselves healthy so we can do our jobs effectively. So our brain is trained to either fight the stress, run away from the stress, or we become paralyzed because we just don't know what to do in that moment. We don't know if we should fight it or if we should run away. And I love this caption here, because you see one guy is like, okay, I think I'm gonna fight. He looks a little scared. But then the other guy's like, nope, I'm running away. So it's just a great example of how your brain is conditioned to make a decision in the moment. And our life experiences kind of help us determine how we're going to respond to stress. It's definitely the body's alarm and alert way of responding to a threatening situation. It is absolutely integral. It's part of every living organism's DNA. They absolutely know when it's time to run and when it's time to fight. And it's our absolute natural defense against danger. If we did not have this, we could not survive. So we have to know how to respond to stress. But unfortunately, sometimes we can become so immune to the stress that we experience in our job that we don't realize that it's actually having an impact on us, and we're not handling it or addressing it effectively, either in our personal or professional life. So let's take a closer look at traumatic stress and secondary trauma. So I believe most of us have heard of post-traumatic stress, right? So post-traumatic stress is something that happens that to us personally, and we have reoccurring thoughts, and it affects about the event, and it may affect our health in terms and our daily living. It might affect our quality of life. Our sleeping might get impacted. Our eating patterns might be impacted. Our anxiety levels might be impacted. And when we talk about traumatic stress, post-traumatic stress especially, these are things that typically happen to us that we have personally experienced. When we, there are a number of things that can happen to human beings that can be natural, that can also be on the job. So when we talk about humans, we're often talking about things like abuse, neglect, assaults against another human being, physical assaults, homicide, acts of war for sure, are human trauma events. Then we have our natural traumatic events like hurricanes, floods, fires, earthquakes, those kinds of things. And then we have on-the-job kinds of stresses that that can happen to us. Sometimes we're fearful at work. We might feel that there's a threat of harm to us from another employee or a client. Sometimes there's an accident that occurred at our job. If we witness something that was accidental and it was traumatic to us, or if we have a threat of physical harm while at work for whatever reason, those are some of the trauma events that can occur in the world and in our lives. So what makes an event traumatic? Well, ultimately, it's the perception of the person that it happened to, because we've known probably people that have experienced similar things that have not looked at the event or experienced the event in the same way. It involves a threat, a real or perceived threat to one's physical or emotional well-being. So if the person perceives it to be a physical or emotional threat, then that's how they're going to respond to it. Others may disagree that it really wasn't that bad, or they don't think you should be responding to it in the way that you are, but regardless, if this is the person's response, then this is how their body's going to react. The event is overwhelming to the person that it happened to. It results in intense fear and feeling like you have lost control. It also leaves you feeling very helpless. You don't know what to do. It consumes you, and you're left with this big feeling, and you don't know how to get rid of it. It also can change the way a person understands the world, themselves, and others. And when we work in helping professions where we are regularly exposed to other people's trauma, we can almost become numb. You know, for those of you that work in the field, I'm sure you've shared a story, obviously without identifying information, but you've shared an experience. Oh, today I heard a story about such and such. And people that aren't in your profession are amazed or shocked, and they can't believe how you work and do the job that you do. And we almost become immune to it, like, oh, this is just what I do. I see this every day. And yeah, that's pretty normal, but it's important for us to really keep in check how it's affecting our lives. And are we eating properly? Is it affecting our sleep? Are there things that we're not able to get out of our head? Is it really something we need to address in a more professional way? Traumatic stress is the stress response to a traumatic event in which one is a victim or a witness. So if you are personally if you personally experienced something or were there at the time that it occurred, this is where traumatic stress occurs, right? So it's something that you were personally involved in, either as a victim or a witness. Secondary traumatic stress or secondary trauma is the natural consequences of the work that you do. It's the consequent behavior and emotions resulting from knowing about traumatized events or experiencing traumatizing events of someone else. The stress resulting from helping or wanting to help traumatized or suffering persons. And you see here a picture of someone, looks like they're at a school. Certainly educators experience this a lot. Folks that are our police officers, firefighters, nurses, doctors, therapists, child welfare workers. These are the folks that are out there every day hearing about things. Investigators, child protective investigators, for sure, are experiencing really serious things. I mean, we're taking a child from their parent. This is a really traumatic experience. This is not something that investigators like to do. So seeing the response of the parent or the child being separated, albeit necessary, it may be necessary to do. These are really hard things that we're asking humans to do. And folks that work with me know that I like to say, we are not robots. We are humans. We have feelings. We don't just go through the motions. And it is important for us to really check in with our peers that are doing similar work and make sure that we have an outlet. And again, we'll talk more about organizational responsibility to care for their employees. Whoops. Work-related trauma and exposure, how does that affect us? We're going to talk about secondary traumatic stress more, obviously compassion fatigue, which is something that can occur if we don't get in touch with how we're being impacted by the stressful events of other people in the work that we do. And then if we absolutely don't check in, we can experience burnout. And when you're at the point of burnout, you're not effective to yourself or anyone else. So we want to avoid burnout by making sure that we are constantly aware within ourselves and within our organization as to how we can stay on top of caring for ourselves, and just embed that within the fabric of the organization and make it a regular part of how we take care of ourselves on a personal level, but also be a part of leading that within our organization if there's not already some sort of protocol within the organization. I mentioned earlier that working with traumatic or folks that have experienced traumatic events in their lives, whether it be physical trauma, someone coming into an emergency room, COVID-19, I tell you, I've watched several things on the news myself that have impacted me and given me another perspective of how this is impacting our medical professionals out there. I think we know kind of on a cerebral level, I guess, what's happening in the hospitals, but when you get down to kind of the personal stories that you're hearing about families being impacted, people who had to say goodbye to loved ones over the phone, healthcare workers are experiencing that and watching all of this happen, and the toll that it's taking on them is tremendous. It transforms when we experience these traumatic events. It transforms and changes the way that we experience the world as a result of the responsibility of having to be empathic and care for traumatized folks. It takes so much energy to drum up that much empathy on a daily basis. We are constantly having to support others and console others and be empathic and emotionally available. And then, not to mention, you go home and you may have a family that you have to be emotionally available for. It's almost, I say to my colleagues and I say to my family, it's like everybody wants a piece of me. I feel like I'm always wanted somewhere. And so how do you keep it together and not snap at the people that you care for, or snap at your coworkers, or God forbid, snap at a client? How do you keep it together? What is the way that we support ourselves and support one another in the very, very hard work that we do as those being those that care for others? It really does shift how we perceive danger and how we perceive the world. I can tell you right now, I personally am much more aware of danger in the world than I think folks that maybe aren't in the field, because I see it. It absolutely does change the way that you perceive the world and other people. We spoke briefly about compassion fatigue, and I'm only going to have this one slide on compassion fatigue and then one slide on burnout, because I really want the majority of what's left of the webinar to be on addressing secondary trauma. But compassion fatigue ultimately occurs when you are just, doing all the things I just mentioned. You're giving of yourself to your patients or your clients, you're giving of yourselves to your colleagues, you're giving of yourself to your family, and you are just done. You are compassionate out. You can't muster up anymore, and you just become drained because you haven't been caring for yourself. And the way that you're thinking has just really drained you. You almost become cynical in a way. And it's really important that we not get to the point where we are fatigued from being so compassionate. We really have to continue to remember the work that we're doing, how important it is, but how important it is to also care for ourselves. The definition of compassion fatigue is a combination of physical, emotional, and spiritual depletion associated with caring for others. You are depleted in every possible way. And so it can happen. If you don't replenish, you will become depleted. So how do you replenish? What do you do? We're going to talk more about that. And then burnout. When you're depleted, when you have completely become depleted, you then burn out. It's a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion. It is something that absolutely happens. I think if you're not burnt out and you haven't experienced compassion fatigue, you can notice it in those that have. And it's important that we assist and help our colleagues out who we see are heading down that path. And again, we have a responsibility as executives and leaders to support staff in a way that give them a safe place to be able to express that. It's not business as usual. It is, yes, we have to do this job, but how do we also support each other? You are going to experience turnover. You are going to experience a lot of the negative effects of not treating and you're not caring for staff if you don't address these things. People will not stay in a place where they don't feel supported, where they're constantly being asked to do hard work and not feeling like they have the support of their peers or the administration or executives within the organization. It's just critical. So we talked about personal and professional examples of secondary trauma earlier. So this is a list. It's a lot of words. I apologize. I typically don't like to put a lot of words on slides, but this is just a nice little table here that shows you the physical, emotional, behavioral, spiritual, cognitive, and relational impacts of personal impact. Physical, I'll run through them briefly. I'm not going to read everything, but physical, there's obviously going to be physical symptoms associated with secondary trauma, like headaches or heavy breathing. Emotional, you might feel powerless. You might have more anxiety. Behavioral, you might be more irritable or snappy, or you might have sleep issues. Spiritual, you might actually, if you once believed they're in a higher power, you might start to question that. You might stop going to church. You might stop going to have spend time with folks that are like-minded just because you've become more cynical. Cognitive, there might be diminished concentration. You might have a hard time focusing. You might start to question yourself, am I being effective? Am I really helping the folks the patients or clients that I think that I'm helping or that I've been hired to help? Am I really doing that? And then relational, it definitely will affect your relationships. You may start to question your significant other or other people in your life, even colleagues. You might begin to mistrust. So it's important that we look at these and then wonder if we're experiencing any of these as a result of secondary trauma exposure. And then professional examples include performance, morale, relational. Again, your relationships are both professional and personal. And so we want to look at those professional relationships. And that can also be behavioral as it relates to your job. You might be calling in sick to work or arriving late or feeling exhausted. You might be overworking. And so moving back up the line here to morale, you definitely can tell when morale is down. It doesn't feel good. Everyone's talking about how horrible the job is or how horrible the administration is. And when you start to see that happen, you really know that there's something going on where staff are not feeling appreciated, valued, supported. And it's definitely time for administration to kind of take the pulse, check the pulse of the staff, and really get in there and do some hard work, or there's going to be a lot of turnover, and that's never good for clients. What are risk factors involved in secondary trauma, related to secondary trauma? Well, there certainly are personal risk factors. If you have a trauma history yourself and you are working with folks who have a trauma history, it's important that you realize that is going to put you at higher risk, because coming from a trauma history and coming into work that deals with trauma, that's absolutely something that may impact or trigger your existing trauma history. If you have a psychological disorder of some sort, if you have a history of a mental health diagnosis, working with folks that have experienced trauma or witnessing trauma, if you are in the healthcare profession, if you're in a hospital and you see people coming in hurt, or you're involved in those kinds of exposures, it may trigger some of your pre-existing condition. If you experienced things at a young age, some of your trauma at a young age, the age of the patient or the client can actually impact you as well. Folks that hear hard stories or regarding children, they are extremely vulnerable, because we know children are helpless, and there's a significant impact for those dealing with children. If you are isolated or you don't have adequate supports, it's important that you recognize that you may be more at risk for developing secondary trauma and having more having more of an impact on your mental health and your physical health. And then if you've had a loss in the past 12 months, you have to recognize that you may be at risk for developing secondary trauma, because you're already vulnerable from that loss emotionally. You may already be vulnerable, or you are vulnerable. So those are important things to keep in mind. Professionally, if you don't have quality supervision within your organization, and I know for my profession, I'm a licensed mental health counselor, we absolutely have that embedded as part of the work that we do. You are required to have clinical supervision and reflective supervision if you're fortunate. But a lot of professions don't have what I consider to be quality supervision, where it's intentional, where you take time out one-on-one with your supervisor, where they're checking in with you and seeing how you're doing. How's this work, affecting you? Tell me more about, the patient that you're seeing or the client that you're seeing. In some professions, you don't have that. You're kind of out there doing your own thing, and it doesn't feel like you have a lot of support within leadership or administration. High percentage of trauma survivors on your caseload. If you have a lot of trauma survivors on your caseload, that can be overwhelming. So as leaders, it's important to assign cases or make sure that staff have a balanced caseload. If you have very little experience in dealing with traumatic folks that have experienced trauma, it could be overwhelming for you if this is the first time you're seeing this or experiencing these kinds of things. If the organization is just a mismatch, where if they're not supporting you and they're not what you need in terms of your own mental health, and then lack of professional support and inadequate orientation and training. If you don't have those kinds of things in place within the organization, that is definitely going to impact you and put you more at risk. And I hope that while you're listening, that you're thinking about the organization that you work for, thinking about what you have in place, and if there are things that you might be able to impact in a positive way. So we're going to talk about self-care as it relates to secondary trauma and caring for yourself. And I love this quote: "Self-care is not selfish or self-indulgent. We cannot nurture others from a dry well. We need to take care of our own needs first. We can give from our surplus, our abundance." I remember, we've all flown probably, and when you're on an airplane, they don't tell you to take care of everybody else and then take care of yourself. Take care of yourself first, and then make sure that so that you can help others. So it's important that we remember that we have got to take care of ourselves if we are going to take care of other people. It's actually, I think, an ethical breach if you're not. If you are not caring for yourself and you are out there caring for others, I don't even see how it can work. It's important that we not be nurturing from a dry well. We have to make sure that our cup is full so that we can give to others. You can't pour from a dry cup, and you can't give to others what you don't have to give. Self-care is what people do for themselves to establish and maintain health and to prevent and deal with illness. Taking care of myself doesn't mean me first, it means me too. And that's so important because I don't think a lot of folks do themselves first, or even not necessarily first, it's just taking care of yourself in addition to taking care of others. Don't forget you. In the midst of caring for other people, don't forget you. When we talk about secondary trauma, we have to also talk about resilience. And when we talk about any kind of trauma, really, we have to talk about resilience, because I've been to a lot of presentations and a lot of talk about trauma, but then it's almost like, okay, well, this is what happens when you've been traumatized or you experience some sort of trauma. But then what about, how do we teach resilience? How do we help folks get to a place where they are overcoming, where they are moving forward? And resilience is something that we have to learn from the moment we start a job, just like we teach resilience to children so that they can overcome and bounce back from difficult experiences. How do we bounce back? Resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, etc. How do we overcome? How do we bounce back? And those are things that we have to learn throughout our career. We don't know them right up front, but we have to have mentors or folks that we learn from. Again, just like children, we teach them how to overcome when they're young. We don't do everything for them and then send them out on their own at 18 and expect that they know how to manage. This is something that we're doing all along. Resilience is how do we overcome? The world is full of bad things that happen. That's just life. We know that that's going to happen. No one is exempt, but how do we overcome? How do we move on? How do we let this not be something that is going to, as I say, be a henny penny, the sky is falling kind of moment? How do we move on and shift our thinking so that we understand that this is a moment of opportunity and a moment for us to learn and move forward? I love the concept of not only resilience, but I love the concept of secondary resilience, because secondary trauma is experiencing trauma that happened to another person, being traumatized by hearing things that happen to other people or experiencing things that happen to other people. But secondary resilience is actually learning how to overcome adversity by experiencing someone else doing that. I don't know about you, but clients that I've served and stories that I hear about the work that we do at the Florida Center absolutely inspire me. And there have been moments where I say, man, I am so grateful that I've heard this story, because it shifts the way I think. And it's a kind of like this beautiful story that you hear about people who are overcoming obstacles, who are overcoming their trauma. Every year at one of our breakfasts, we have a champion. We have all these champions that we recognize in the community, but one of the champions that we recognize is a parent. And these are parents often that have overcame obstacles, that are being champions for their children. And their stories are so inspiring. So secondary resilience, it involves a process of learning about overcoming adversity from the trauma survivor themselves. And the resulting positive transformation and the empowerment through their empathy and interaction is something that absolutely is contagious. So just like secondary trauma, somebody else's trauma can be impactful and can be contagious. So can secondary resilience. When we assist a client, when we see a client overcome adversity, a traumatic situation, and we see them overcome that, it is absolutely inspirational, and it shifts our thinking in a positive way. So when our worldview is shifted, it doesn't always have to be in a negative way. We can absolutely have our worldview shifted in a positive way through secondary resilience. The impact of secondary resilience is that we have a greater perspective and appreciation of our own problems. We look at our problems sometimes and go, man, what was I complaining about? So kind of overcoming this major obstacle that I have never in my life experienced and probably won't. But this person has such an optimistic view of life. And we've all heard stories like that, if not in real life on TV, right? Experiencing secondary trauma can also, secondary resilience can also help us to become more optimistic, more motivated to do our work, to give us help us realize why we're in this field. Like, this is why we do it. I remember seeing emails from our CEO, like, this is why we do the work that we do. She just positive emails about something that happened, to a family or to a client, or a success story that she heard. And there are absolutely those moments that remind us why we do what we do, and that's secondary resilience. It can give us an increased sense of hope, understanding, and belief in the the possibility of recovery from trauma, that it can happen. Because I think sometimes we forget that there are positive stories. We get bombarded. It's the negative stories, the sad stories, the really impactful stories that affect us. But we also need to remember the stories where people are overcome. It can also give us a profound sense of commitment and find meaning from the work that we do. And I love this quote from Rick Warren: while it is wise to learn from experience, it is wiser to learn from the experience of others, which is so true. Self-care, it isn't everything, right? So while it's important to practice self-care, exercising, meditation, prayer, whatever works for you, having reflective groups at work, it's important to know that it is absolutely an occupational challenge for those in the helping profession. Sometimes it's overwhelming to figure out what it is that we need to do to avoid becoming negatively impacted by secondary trauma. And for folks in the child welfare system, for those working in law enforcement, counselors working with traumatized children, these professions are profoundly impacted. I think I read somewhere that anywhere from 6 to 26% of those working in the child welfare system, working with child welfare dependency work, doing dependency work, are experience secondary trauma. It's a large percentage, and we need to really think about how we're supporting those. Or organizations have an ethical mandate of a duty to train their staff, wherein workers are taught about the potential negative effects of the work and how to cope. It's not just something that we say, oh, well, this is a job you signed up for, you went to college for this, don't complain. The reality is it takes a major toll on staff, and we have, as leaders, as professionals, we have an ethical obligation to train our staff and make sure that they are trained, not just to do the job. Doing the job is not usually the hard part. It's how do we manage the emotional and mental stress that comes from the job in dealing with the clients and the exposure to some of the traumatic events that occur within the job. First, it's important that we understand what it means to be a trauma-informed organization. So if your organization is not trauma-informed, but you've heard maybe buzzwords about being trauma-informed or doing more trauma trainings, that's great. But just know that this one training, you're not going to leave and become an expert and forever, never be affected by secondary trauma. It's important to, I say, you got to go to the gym. It's a muscle you have to work out all the time in order to understand what it means to be a trauma-informed person, a trauma-informed professional, and to have a trauma-informed organization. These organizations recognize the work-related challenges of their staff and clients and assume the responsibility for proactively addressing the impact of secondary trauma through policies, procedures, practices, and programs. It is embedded within the fabric of the organization. It starts from the top down, the leaders understand, and they have protocol in place in order to support the staff within their organization. The staff also know what it means to support the clients. And we call this, in my world, the mental health world, a parallel process, meaning the executives support the directors, support the supervisors, support the staff who support the clients. It's all the way down, and again, called a parallel process. And it has to happen, and it can happen. It takes a while to make it happen, but as long as it's something that's in the forefront of the organization's mindset, it absolutely can happen. And we have lots of people in our community that are trained in this arena that are willing to work with organizations to help them become more trauma informed. Some of the key aspects of a healthy trauma-informed organization is when you have healthy leadership and mission, that an effective leadership, clarity and alignment with the mission, management and supervision, there's clear, respectful, quality, inclusive of vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatization. I forgot to mention earlier, if you've heard the term vicarious traumatization, that employee empowerment and work environment, promotes peer support and team effectiveness. And that's really important because our peers are it's kind of like our family away from our family, you know, our home away from home. So if we can have a supportive peer network, that's huge. So, and it doesn't have to be happy hour. Well, I know a lot of folks like to do that. So it needs to occur during the workday, because happy hour is not on work time. That's people doing whatever they want on their free time. What happens if it happens during the day, during work hours, that organization is saying this is so important, then we're committing to allowing staff to use work time to address their mental health and emotional health needs as it relates to the stress of the job. Training and professional development. Do we have adequate training and professional development? And how are we measuring that this training is effective for our staff? That they're not just attending a training, checking off, yes, I did this, but how is it making them better at the job that they're doing? That's really important. And then finally, staff and health wellness. And usually this happens from the top down. Again, it devotes priority and resources to sustaining practices, and it's something that everyone feels and knows, and everyone just accepts that this is the way we roll. This is how we do business within our organization. We treat each other and our clients this way, and it's a very trauma-informed perspective, and we're really respecting the work that we do and helping each other every day. What happens when organizations don't address secondary trauma? Well, it's quite a negative outcome. First, there's lost productivity. Folks can't concentrate. Morale is down. Most of us have worked a time or two for an organization or within an organization where there has been morale has been low, and you have to think about what the causes are. And typically, it's folks not feeling supported. While money is sometimes, you know, it sometimes helps. Most people will stay even if they're not getting paid what they feel like they should be paid, if they feel supported and valued. Communication, collaboration, quality of services are all part of loss of productivity. And we know that time is money. And when you are not as productive, then the organization is losing money, even if they're not producing widgets. We are not producing widgets, we're working with humans, and we still lose money when we're not as productive within nonprofits. Poor organizational health, erosion of concentration, focus, decision-making, motivation, performance, all of those things can happen if we don't feel supported as a result of working with clients who are exposed to traumatic events. And then that ultimately results in staff turnover. As a leader or as a supervisor or director, you don't want to have to hire over and over and over again. time and resources needed to hire and train new staff. It drains the remaining staff. They've got to learn who the new person is, that somebody's got to train them. There's just so much that goes into bringing on new staff. We need to nurture and support the staff that we have. So the only reason that they leave is because they're moving away and they can't stay, right? So we want to make sure that we're not having to deal with the negative effects of secondary trauma. And this is our final slide. I wanted to end with this. Empathy is a finite resource. You can run out. As a normal psychological response, you cannot give yourself again and again and again without replenishing. I want to thank you guys for being a part of this presentation today. And I wish you all well, and I look forward to presenting other webinars for you in the future. And if you have any questions at all, you certainly can reach out to me. This is my email, my phone number, and my extension I didn't put on there, but my extension is 1021. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all. I'm happy to respond. And thanks again.